Hello, this is Curt Pringle, and thank you for tuning in to the Talking Issues series. Today we have someone very interesting that you need to know. And, we all know our government levels, the country and the state, and usually a county and a city, but very few people know they're a regional government that takes in a lot of the long-term planning aspects for how communities develop and where we go in the future. And right here in Southern California, we have the largest local government in America. It's called SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments. It's made up of 6 counties and 191 cities are all part of this government entity, and it's all managed by the executive director, Kome Ajise. Glad you're here, Kome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I'm not going to go back and forth on your last name because
That's
that's
all right.
tricky. So I'm going to talk Kome, and I'm not hoping to not be
That's
disrespectful.
that's actually very good.
Yeah, exactly. So, uh, yes, the setup is you don't run fire stations and you don't build parks necessarily, but you plan for them and you work with all these cities and all these county governments for that long-term future of a region. And tell me what that broad responsibility is.
Oh, thank you again. Thanks so much for having me here and giving us a chance to talk about SCAG.
Sure.
The Southern California Association of Governments, otherwise known as SCAG, is the Metropolitan Planning Organization. It's a federal designation that we have over the 6 counties and 191 cities in Southern California. And that federal designation requires us to do a long-range planning for the regional long-range planning for the region, and especially looking at transportation and the connected items to transportation, housing, land use, jobs, and things like that. And in our job, in our the work that we do at SCAG, really the emphasis that we put on our work is we're here to help the cities and the counties do what they do best. We do the long range planning such that federal and state funds will flow to infrastructure projects in our region.
Yeah, so part of that is, I mean, there's a whole group of people that would look and say, why do we need any long-term planning on a regional basis? Why can't cities and counties just do that? But at the end of the day, most people who are driving the freeway in Riverside want to get someplace else
Yes.
into San Bernardino or Orange County or LA for that matter. And is that really the foundational point when metropolitan planning organizations were established, that everybody needs to be talking to one another, so you need to have a cohesive plan in these metropolitan
I,
areas?
I think you're exactly right. When you have federal or state investment in infrastructure in any region or any part of the state or locality or county, there's a need to make sure that we're all working in sync and not at cross purposes. So if I'm building a road in Anaheim, is it connecting to the next city
Right.
appropriately? And I'm using federal funds to do that. What's the likelihood that what the federal government or the state investing in Anaheim is going to return its own investment because it's connected to something else
Right.
downstream
So,
outside of the city.
yeah, and
So
so
we have,
but what is that power you have? Do you
well,
have power beyond planning, or is your power basically as the conduit of federal resources and in some cases state resources for those bigger projects?
well, I think the power is really about collaboration. We have to keep in mind, SCAG is not just some agency out there with faceless and non-defined. SCAG is actually run by local elected officials. And so the construct, I think, is genius because it's really understanding that there are issues, there are potential opportunities to make sure that cities get together and work out on things that transcend their boundaries.
Right.
Roads, transportation, air quality, energy, housing, these are things that can't be solved by any one city, irrespective of how big you are as a city.
Right.
You sort of are tied to other cities and other communities to actually make headway. And so that really is the point of a regional agency, is to bring all of these elected leaders together and reason together about how we grow in a more sustainable way in a way that makes sense for our local communities to thrive. And so the opportunity we have at the regional level is to actually get away from the parochial look that we might have in one city that will discount what the needs of the next city is, to kind of figure out what's the best interest of the entire region, such
Yeah,
that each city can thrive.
right. And that is, you have an 86 member board?
Yes,
Holy cow. So voices in San Bernardino and voices in Long Beach are included
yes.
on these regional discussions.
And Imperial and Ventura
And
and
Orange
LA
County, yes, I
County and
want to make
Orange
sure we
County.
hit all the buttons.
Absolutely.
But from a regional government perspective, I mean, um, how does the priorities of one region be heard if they're in conflict, or in one county if they're in conflict with voices from another county?
So I think that's a potential that you would see occur. There are things that might be required by federal and state law that may not necessarily fit squarely in one community or the other. What we try to do, at least at the SCAG level, is two things. One is to just very healthily represent the needs of our region to both state and federal. So we have this advocacy component where we relate to folks that one size does not fit all as you make state or federal policy. So we try to do that. And it's not just staff that does it, it's our elected officials that come from these various communities that would be part of the delegation that goes to Sacramento or go to Washington, D.C.
And if we're talking about from the transportation side, I think people can
Immediately
immediately
see that.
visualize that need for the bigger projects that are moving forward. So one of your responsibilities is to create kind of that region-wide long-term transportation plan,
Yes.
right? So what is in the current long-term transportation plan? What would people say, okay, I understand this broader need for cooperation beyond all these county lines?
So in the long-term plan, and the play, when you think of transportation, you can't think of it in isolation. Transportation is connected to what's happening on the land. So
Yeah,
it's the
where
land
you are
use.
and where you're going.
Yes, where are we going?
Yes.
Where are we coming from?
Yes.
And so those origin destinations make a lot of sense. The origin destinations are precisely talked about in every city's general plan. And so our job at SCAG is to pull all of the city's general plans together and make sense of it, make a regional sense of it, such that we could see where the jobs are. So we use three key components to determine what the regional plan would look at in terms of building a scenario or vision for the future. We look at housing, households, basically, not necessarily housing, but households, the number of households based on data and where that growth is going to be. We look at employment, and then we look at population. And so those three components kind of give us a sense of where people are and where the activities are, and then what the necessary connections need to be in terms of future connections that we need to make.
Yeah,
And so
it's
that sort of
right.
gives us the sense of what the future looks like.
So you look at, so people who may have a fear that it's a regional direction, you start with every city has to prepare what's called a general plan. And
Yes.
within their general plan, they have to have, a lot of people know what the housing element is because that's been a point of discussion, and we can talk about that in a minute. But there's also a transportation
And a
element,
circulation
within
element,
the
yes.
circulation element. Therefore, every city is saying this is how we propose
Yes.
to address these things, and then that's usually pulled up within the transportation agency of the county. In Orange County, it's OCTA.
Yes.
LA Metro is LA,
LA.
and those are the documents you use to inform this
That's right.
region-wide long-term.
So we get from each county, we get the long range transportation plan from each county, but we also spend time looking at where the land use is in each of our cities and what the quality or characteristics, I should say, of the land use is, because that gives us a sense of where the origins and destinations are. And we have this model that's required by the federal government that allows us to not only talk about where things are and where people are coming and going from, but also what kinds of emissions we're going to have in terms of the Federal Clean Air Act, such that we meet our region's goals for clean air.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a combination of a lot of things,
Sure.
but with the intent of, again, I think there is a sense that public policy intends for us to have a better environment to live in, have a good infrastructure system to get us to and from our places of need that we need to be, whether it's employment, school, medical appointments, recreation, those kinds of things. But also that there is enough housing to house the people that we know the population is there. So
Sure.
when you're trying to balance those things,
Right.
you begin to see what the options, what the public
So,
policy
so some of
options are.
those options, though, in transportation, who dictates that slate of options? I mean, is it the desire to reduce greenhouse gases that focus that because that's a state priority, and under the last presidential administration, that was that administration's priority? Or is it converting the type of transport modes of transportation people rely upon from single car vehicles to mass transit connections? I mean, who really has the voice in pressuring what that long-term plan is?
I think that's a great question. In our case, in our region, for the most part, the choices we've made for transportation takes into consideration what the federal mandates or the state mandates are, obviously, but it also takes very clearly into consideration what the local and regional needs are. And so in at least 5 of our 6 counties, we have local tax measures that have
Mm-hmm.
already identified
Yeah.
what the folks want,
Mm-hmm.
and voters have voted on those things. And so that becomes your beginning sort of place to look at the infrastructure needs that we've already committed to as communities within our region. And so we have a playbook, county by county,
Right.
and
Right.
and it's also very coordinated. So this counties just don't go into a corner and create their playbook and hope that the other county connects. Well, these things are coordinated because we have a lot of good professionals working at them,
Yes.
obviously. And so the sales tax measure in Orange County lays out projects that the measure is going to build over time. But those roads and connections and rail systems also connect to things to systems outside of Orange County.
Right.
Otherwise, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense.
Right.
Understanding that there's a lot of commute between Orange County and Riverside, as an example.
Right.
And so that's taken into
Yeah.
consideration. And folks on the Riverside County side are looking at the same.
Certainly. To look at that, I was on OCTA in 2006
Yes.
when the last sales tax measure was written. And I guess I think about the state pressures on greenhouse gases and emissions and the shift to electric vehicles and such. So that discussion of priorities in 2006 that the voters voted on in 2006, um, uh, how do they catch up? Because they're already somewhat set in concrete,
Yeah.
so to speak, uh, set in 2006 to reflect what will happen in the future 30 years when technologies and other things change. I mean, to me, that is one of the difficulties of you relying upon that, then having to conform the region's long-term plan to something that was set up in LA County or in Ventura County or Orange County, you know, a couple decades before that.
Well, it's certainly a challenge to imagine something in just the year 2000 and then hope that it doesn't change when in fact change is the one constant in
Yes,
our lives.
yes, exactly.
And I think one of the things that we're fortunate with is we get to do this every 4 years. We get to do an update to our planning every 4 years, and so do each of our counties. They go through their long range plan every 4 years, and there's an update to it. Each of the measures also have enough flexibility that projects could be tweaked to make sure that it's taking advantage of what the new technology is that's current and makes sense. As public officials, our one determinant of what needs to be done is to make sure that we're using public funds as judiciously as possible. And so when you begin to see that maybe what we identify that we're going to do several years ago is not going to work, there's always an opportunity to make that adjustment and go through the process that you need to make the adjustment.
So to be this metropolitan planning agency is the word I said organization, but it's agency,
Organization,
right? It's organization,
yeah,
metropolitan
MPO.
organization, which is therefore that federal recognition. Are you the strongest voice then in seeking federal funds in the region by saying this is consistent with the metropolitan area's long-term plan and transportation? I mean, if it's a part of a local transportation agency and then it's a part of your plan, then you are the strong advocate on the federal side for funding.
We certainly are a strong advocate by virtue of being the MPO, because the Regional Transportation Plan, or what we call Connect SoCal now, and the SCS, which is the state component of Connecting Land Use and Transportation, they've become the basis for part of federal and state decisions on funding. So if you're asking the federal government to fund a project, one of the first questions they'll ask you is it in SCAG's Regional Transportation Plan? If it's not, they probably will not fund it. And you might have a real good project. And so most folks know that. So a lot of good projects will begin their journey by being part of the planning process and
So,
being the
so,
SCAG
so you
plan.
mentioned SCS, so Sustainable Community
Strategy,
Strategies legislation, I believe authored by Darrell Steinberg, and
Yes,
this
SB 375.
farmer state senate leader. Um, that brought down to the state level kind of the marrying between transportation and housing and making sure there's a reduction in emissions or greenhouse
That's right.
gases, right? I mean and that's within your purview now. You have the responsibility of putting that plan together for the region.
Yes, and I began to talk about the two things that we do. One is to make sure we advocate to the state and federal governments what the regional needs and the local needs are. The other is to be able to interpret what comes from the federal and state government
Oh,
to our
that's a very much bigger job to make
to,
that.
to our local agencies and our region. And one of those areas is SB 375,
Right.
which requires that we do this SCS, the Sustainable Community Strategy, every 4 years with the regional plan. So when we do the regional plan, we just don't submit a transportation plan. The regional transportation plan is a requirement by both federal and state to condition funding for infrastructure investments from federal and state. Uh, Attached to that is this Sustainable Community Strategy that assures the state that we've done some level of work to connect the transportation plan to the land use decision making locally, and to make sure that as we do that, we're also reducing greenhouse gases over time, and we'll give assigned targets. The last target is 19% from the 1995 levels that we need to reduce by 2035. And so our plan would show how we would get to that reduction by showing the kinds of investments we have and the policy decisions we're making as a region collectively. And so we've been able to demonstrate that. And that allows the SES then to be approved by the California Air Resources Board, which then conditions funding from the state, because a lot of housing funding and transportation funding is now tied to having an SES that's compliant
Right.
to
Yeah,
SB 375.
those are huge struggles, but I think the one thing that people need to see is when those entities are created, then we have two choices. And that is either uh, move forward with that planning that's required by the federal government or the state, or ignoring it and then losing the opportunity for resources. And sometimes that mandate is out of our hands. You know, you
Yes.
talk about a 19% reduction, so you have a base year of whatever 1990,
95, yeah.
95, and then everything is based off that base year. So you have every year a goal of reducing emissions or greenhouse gases based upon that base year. So if you have the target, what, just for people's information, what are the things that you can do to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from a base year of 1995? I mean, what
Well,
are the biggest areas of success?
I think there are a number of things that a lot of our cities are already doing and we're doing. on a regional basis. We're building more bike lanes and more pedestrian opportunities. There are things where there are trips we call short trips. These are trips that are within half a mile to a mile, maybe a mile and a half from home, where we go get maybe a gallon of milk. In most communities, you'd have to drive. In many communities, you have to drive to do that because you don't have the infrastructure to walk or bike. We're seeing a lot more bike lanes. I think over the last plan period, we've seen about 1,000 miles of bike lanes added to our region. We expect to see about 4,000 more miles of bike lanes added to our region. That begins to take the pressure off of driving. And so it's really looking for strategies that reduce driving. Having the opportunities for transit and have people take more transit. We're seeing investment in transit in Orange County with OCTA, with the cable car, with investments that we're seeing in just about every transit agency. LA Metro has some major investments. One of the biggest construction activities in the country is in Los Angeles with LA Metro, about $20 billion in investment. We're seeing transit
But on
rideshare
those,
come
where's
back.
the measure though? I mean, I see bike lanes and I would love to spend more time being able to ride a bike, and I don't. I do have bikes. My wife and I do, uh, but uh, the question I think people would say, because that's a really good uh, example where I think people can visualize exactly those lanes that we see on the side of the street, and we realize there's very few people ever using
Using
them.
them, yeah.
So is the measure to build the bike lane, or is the measure how many people use the bike lane?
Well, the measure has to be the use of the bike lane.
Right. And then how
Uh,
do you measure that? I mean, where are you measuring it over 1,000 miles of bike lane?
we're seeing the construction of those bike lanes, but we
Okay.
also do survey of ridership on the bike lanes from time to time to see, because one of the things that we look at in our modeling is to see what the mode shift or mode split is. So what's the population, what's the percentage of total traffic is on bikes? What's the proportion on
Right.
pedestrians and proportion on transit
Right.
and who's driving in a carpool and who's driving alone?
Right.
And so the key is to reduce those driving alone. Now, that's still going to be your number one largest share of mobility is folks driving alone. And so, but you don't reduce that if you don't create more choice. And so our objective in the region is to have more choice. It's not suggesting people should not have cars. Folks can have as many cars as they can afford, but should they need to drive it all the time? I think is the question. And there are a lot of us that have cars and don't need to drive it because you have to worry about
You live
parking.
close to where you work, so
I
that's
live,
good. You're a
yeah.
lucky
So
guy.
I'm unique in that way. Maybe
Yes.
I'm lucky in that
Yeah.
way that I live close to work. I can walk to my
Right.
office,
Right.
or if I'm lazy, I can get a scooter, or I can hop on the
Right.
train and go to the office. But that's because I have a choice.
Right.
If I didn't have those choices, I may have had to. Maybe I would drive.
Yeah, so let's talk about one of those choices. I mean, every single one of the counties and transportation agencies have seen a pretty dramatic drop off in bus usage,
Yes.
traditional buses on street usage, um, since what, 2018, but probably goes all the way back to 2010, that reduction started. I mean, if you see a drop in one of those uses that by definition would reduce emissions if otherwise if they're using single vehicles, or is that reduction those people aren't going anywhere? I mean, how do you see that accounting of reduction in bus use? Is it more people using cars or more people working from home, or how is that measured?
Well, I think it's a
Sorry,
combination
that's
of
a curveball, but I was
no,
just
no.
thinking about the
Yeah.
challenge with buses is fewer people are
It's in
really
fact
riding them.
it's a real uh, policy conundrum that we're working on. I think it's a combination of a number of things. You're seeing, we did a study with UCLA back in 2019 because we saw the decline in ridership on transit. That was a concern because
Hmm.
we're hoping that more people would be taking transit. Of course, COVID did not help, where people stayed home.
And
and
now COVID amplified that because
amplified it.
people, they don't want to be in the same vehicle with
Exactly.
other people
Yeah,
necessarily.
because we're social distancing, so you needed to be away from folks.
Right.
So most people stayed home. Now, even before COVID, we were seeing that decline and try to figure out, well, what is the reason for the decline? Well, one of the things that came out in the study with UCLA is it was just easier to get a car for especially for folks that are lower income, which was a little bit of an enlightening finding for us that you would think most people would assume intuitively folks lower income or transit will probably use transit and less likely to have a car because cars are expensive to maintain. But we saw that it was actually cheaper to buy a car for many of these folks, not because they wouldn't want to use transit, but because the commutes were getting longer and people are living further away from work, and transit did not serve all of those needs. And we really couldn't afford transit serving every single need. Transit is really good in a very compact environment with dense land uses and things like that.
Right.
And so it made sense then for folks to just go ahead and get car, and it was cheaper. Credit wise, it was really easy to get a car, used cars and things like that. So that was working against transit. We saw that. Well, of course, with COVID, we also saw a drop in transit, really dramatic drop in transit. What we've seen since COVID is transit is really coming back to full strength. Not quite at
Yeah.
the strength it was before COVID.
Yeah.
There are a number of routes in Orange County and in LA County and across the region that are back to normal. And some routes are even beyond the beyond the pre-COVID era. But we also know that post-COVID, a lot of our commute traffic are now staying home. So we used to estimate that work from home pre-COVID was in the 7% range, under 10%. Now we're seeing it went up as high as about 27, almost 30%. During COVID, it's come back down to stabilize at about 17%.
Yeah. Oh,
And so that's still
yeah.
substantial in terms of the difference in folks that are working from home.
So does that get scored?
Yeah, it gets scored. These are the things that we have
So when
to
you do your
calculate.
regular update,
Yes.
you may not be putting as much money into bike lanes, or you
No,
may not be
actually,
putting as much
actually,
money into buses or other transit because you see you have the savings in people working
I
from
think
home.
the reverse is probably the case because we need to invest more to make transit a little more adaptive to the needs that we see out there. And so, whereas pre-COVID, we had a lot of transit activity focused on commute, where folks are getting on the bus or on the train to get to work because everybody's going to a central location for work. Post-COVID, we're seeing that the travel is more dispersed. And so there's a need for midday service instead of just the morning commute and the evening commute back, which was the focus of transit pre-COVID. What we're seeing now is there's a lot of travel happening midday. And so Metrolink, which is very dependent on commute traffic as a rail service across 5 counties, is now doing a lot of adjustment to their scheduling such that there is services during the middle of the day when there are folks that are actually trying to get around. Now there's a lot more weekend travel because folks want to get places and they don't want to drive. And so we're seeing a larger population of folks that are choosing transit because transit is adapting to where and when people need to ride them. And we're also noticing, I think this is probably not necessarily a revelation, that we're aging in place as a population. And so the proportion of older Southern Californians is growing faster
Right.
than the population itself.
And I think
And so,
everybody, all the young people who want to buy a house see that.
yeah,
And
because
there's a
we're
lot
aging
of
in place.
elements of that. So, yeah, let's talk about housing. I mean, we referenced SCAG's responsibility in transportation areas and seeing that in a regional plan, sustainable community strategies, air quality, air emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And really, one, I think a lot of people may never have heard of SCAG before they and their local communities started hearing about housing elements and RENA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, which has been in place for a long
Long
time.
time.
Um, but it really was pushed to the forefront when the state target for housing was moved up so high, what, 2.5 million people within the planning cycle, and then that statewide target gets pushed down to MPOs like you, these metropolitan planning
Yeah.
organizations, where you were given the responsibility. And what percentage of the total RENA statewide numbers, what did SCAG have?
Well,
60,
we we
65%? Or
we got I can't remember the exact number.
yes.
I just know the number
Yeah,
that we were given.
what was the
It
number?
was 1.3 million.
So 1.3 of the
Two and a
2.5
half million. Yeah.
is now told you,
Yeah.
as a planning organization, work with these 6 counties, all of your 86 board members, and determine how much allocation goes to every city and county in your region. That,
Yes.
that was your responsibility, right?
Yes.
Oh, that's a nice responsibility.
It's
You didn't establish the number. You didn't establish the plan. You just had to fulfill
to
that
come up with
requirement.
the methodology for
Yes.
splitting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating process, the RENA process. I think it was well intended to make sure, because the maxim is, if you don't plan for it, you can't execute it. And so planning for housing became part of public policy in California.
Right.
And like you said, the RENA law has been around for well over 40 years, and it's been practiced. And this was the last cycle was the sixth cycle, and it's every 8 years that RENA comes around. So the next one is creeping up on us.
Yes.
And I liken it to being responsible for throwing a party that nobody wants to come to, and they're forced to come to it. And after it's over, the stink of the party stays with you for the next 4 years.
Yes, exactly. Right. Or
and-
picking up all the beer cans or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah. So the RENA process is an assignment that SCAG has. We work with the State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, to come up with a determination. They get initial numbers from us. We kind of give them a sense from our perspective what our housing capacity might be over the next 8 years, and in terms of needs. So we do that needs assessment. We send it to them. We go back and forth. They use DOF numbers, and they come up with their number of different things they look for. Vacancy factor. They look for, whether or not we have cost burden in our region, which would mean that folks are paying a lot more for housing than, a certain level. Usually, I think the federal level is 30% of income on housing. When there's cost burden, that means you
And
don't
in
have enough supply.
your area is what percentage does the average person spend on housing?
Well, I think in our region is well over 30%,
Right,
and
exactly.
it varies because when you also factor in what it costs folks to commute to work,
Right.
it's really a part of the housing cost because they have to move so
Right.
far away from work, and so it can end up in the 50 to 60% range that people are spending on housing related costs.
So those people that understand the fact there's a market system that overlies everything else in terms of this, if you look at the factor of how much people pay for housing, that naturally should be something considered.
Yes.
Because if you're paying more for housing, that means there's demand for housing, which drives up the price for
Price
housing.
for housing.
Even for those people who are looking for housing for their family because they're working, in many cases, a lower income, lower paying job, or for those people, who have kids like me that want to make sure the kids and grandkids stay around them. There
Yeah.
needs to be housing all the way through that housing
Yeah.
spectrum. And that really is seen by how much does it cost for housing, which that means there's a demand for that
Yeah,
housing.
and I think that's the intention, is to make sure that we estimate all of those needs. So is there overcrowding? Is there cost burden? Are these things prevalent in the community? And so that then begins to turn into factors that determines how many more units we need within a certain region, and in this case, the SCAG region. When we did the estimation for the sixth cycle, we thought we needed, in the region, we might need about 800,000 to 900,000. It's a range.
Right.
Housing units that we could see.
And then you were asked to figure it out with 1.3 million people.
But the number that comes back that you have to work with is what the state law calls a determination, and that determination came from the state, from HCD, that in our case, based on their estimation, it's not 800,000.
Yeah.
It's 1.3 million.
And a lot of people will even look at the 800,000 But it is interesting to see that your estimate was maybe 500,000 less than what the state is requiring SCAG in the region to plan for
Yeah,
in terms of housing. But but um, it is a cycle. So it's an 8-year cycle that came into being what 2021 to 2029 or something like
29,
that.
yes.
And therefore over this period of time we've seen the first time ever in this state's history a drop in population. So a lot of people, hey, I'm a big advocate for more housing. I think anybody who knows me knows that. So I'm not trying to create any excuses for not developing more housing. But there is a legitimate point to be made that that original target was awfully high, higher than ever before, of 2.5 million. It gets pushed down to you, where you have a regional requirement higher than what your agency projected for the 6 counties. And now we see population uh, leaving the state. Is there any midpoint of adjustment, or is it this is done now with this cycle, and possibly the adjustment will be taken in the next cycle, which will be the crafting of the next housing element 2030?
I would imagine that would be the case because there is nothing in the process right now that allows us to adjust the numbers, given the drop in population. And the drop really was very marginal because we're seeing population go back up,
Yes.
and so we're growing
Yeah, but
again
it
as
was
a state.
dropped marginally, but a drop uniquely because it never had happened before, and the projections were on a
On a
growing
growing,
state, not a
exactly,
declining state,
absolutely.
or an even
It
a leveling state.
leveling,
It
yeah.
was always
You know, no,
projection of
you're
growth.
absolutely right, and I think that's part of what we need to think through. And when we talk about housing, it's not just one type of housing; it's
Yeah.
really multiple types of housing in terms of supply. But one of the conditions that I think we don't really factor into the RENA cycle or the RENA process is the market conditions.
Yeah.
Our cities do not necessarily build housing by themselves. This is intended for them to plan for and make room for housing to show up in
Private
the
sector development. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
make private sector show up
Right.
and build those units.
Right.
And so the force of law in RENA is making cities actually take these numbers that are assigned to them through this process that came out of SCAG and then zone for each one of the units that we assign to them. I think that's a process that can be onerous on some cities, because it's not a cheap process to update your general plan.
Right.
And so we at SCAG have sort of, and I feel like I need to plug this, we sort of had to do some extra work to create some ease in the process for many of our cities. We have 191 cities. At least 20% of them are population of 20,000 or less. These are small cities. 80%, 70% of our cities, I say maybe 68% of our cities, 100,000 population or less. And so most of our cities out of the 191 are really small cities, by definition. And so their capacity to just turn around and update general plans is not as nimble as one would expect. General plan updates are expensive. You have to do an EIR. You have to go through a lot of processes. It's not an excuse.
Right. But
I'm not
unlike
making an excuse.
any other EIR, which would, if a private developer wanted to build here, they would need to go through an EIR, but that private developer would have to pay
Pay
for
for
it.
it.
In this case, the city
The
government,
city
the
has,
taxpayers of
yeah,
those cities are paying for all that environmental work to
exactly.
accomplish that.
And so one of the things that we did at SCAG, which I thought our team was really thinking through this, was to create a set data sets for each city that was pre-approved by HCD, by the state, such that each city didn't have to reinvent the wheel. If they used the data sets that we had come up with and been pre-approved, and then their process was shortened in trying to get to the objective of creating a housing element.
Yeah, and so part of that arena is not just looking at the need for housing, but also the need for housing, as you pointed out, in certain economic sectors.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of people,
for income categories, yeah.
yes, there's a pushback in a lot of neighborhoods, communities for low income housing. That I'm located here in the Platinum Triangle, of which 2 buildings here are moderate level affordability designated.
Yeah.
So that's a low income category,
Mhm.
defined by the state. And I have it right here. Moderate level income to qualify for that in Orange County is a family of four making $154,000 a year or less.
Yeah.
But even the low
Lower income.
income in Orange County, the designation of one person living in the house is a salary of $88,400 a year or less. So I think some folks miss the fact that when you're in a higher cost area and where you have people making more money, those definitions of moderate level affordability or low
They're
level
very,
or very low are numbers of which, a single woman becoming a firefighter in Anaheim or a neighboring city may very well be making less than $88,000
that's
a
right.
year. And I think sometimes there's a miss as to these definitions that people may perceive how they were 20 years ago or 50 years ago or in different states. They're applied regionally here. And those are the numbers we use to make
Absolutely.
that assessment.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think these are variabilities that doesn't go into some of the intent of the law.
Right.
Yeah, so we have these four income categories. Um, I think one of the things you hear developers say is the cost of building a unit, whether it's a very low income or a high end, it's really not that different. It's the finishing cost that makes the difference in
Right.
the unit because the land cost and the labor cost and the cost for permitting
And parking.
and parking requirements.
Parking's going to be somewhat the same
And you know
challenge.
and also just dealing with the issues of the various codes that you have to deal with.
Right.
All of those are they're uniform across all those income categories. So that's already a base cost of the unit.
Right.
And so the difference in the very high income and the low income comes to what kind of material in the neighborhood that
Yeah.
building is in.
Help me answer this question though. I mean, right now I think there's a frustration, and I don't think it's a political philosophy frustration, but it might be just a philosophical frustration about the concept of land use issues such as development should be locally controlled. And then through, be it the RENA set, which is a state directed to a regional focus, or all the legislation that's passed in state government on housing, all of those things. There continues to be this frustration of, well, if this should be a local decision made locally, not a state mandate or a whole set of new state rules on who should approve housing. I mean, you're kind of stuck in the middle on that. How do you feel about that, and how best can you explain the necessity of what we've been going through the last decade?
No, it's not a horrible place to be stuck in because housing is so fundamental to our region. In fact, we've sort of, I've deemed it an existential issue. The housing crisis is an existential issue for us in our region, and I use the analogy of, we graduate out of 24 or so world-class four-year colleges in our SCAG region. We graduate thousands and thousands of new talent, most of whom can't stay here
Right.
because of housing costs. And so, of necessity, bringing down the housing, reducing the housing crisis and making housing affordable is really key to us because it then allows us to keep talent here, jobs stay here, and we continue to thrive as a regional economy. And so I feel like we feel like this is something we need to be a part of helping to solve. And state mandates and state requirements that are one size fits all don't work. And so we've tried to help inform the state about those things. We've seen, legislation that was well intentioned, that would hopefully help housing move faster, takes away some control at the local level, and that creates some aggravation because you sort of lose your perspective on wanting to be part of that process if your community doesn't have any control over it. At the same time, there's an imperative to make sure that we house everyone in our region. If we're gonna support this regional economy that has talents from various walks of life, supported by low-income workers because we need them for these activities to thrive in our region, we need to be able to provide housing across that spectrum. And so there is a need there to begin to think about it. So what I was describing earlier on about the cost per unit, just the average cost per unit being so high,
Right.
conditions us to start thinking about a government intervention where there has to be some way where government subsidizes to bring the price down, to get within that framework of funding.
Yes.
I think the firefighters should be able to live within your community. I think that should be a goal that we strive for. How we get there should be a matter of public policy.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't just say, well, just go build units. We should be thinking very deliberately about who's going to live in those units and how do we make that available for them. And I just imagine, heaven forbid we have an emergency within a community and your firefighters live 2 hours away, and they're your first responders, and your teachers don't live close enough, and your gardeners and all of those folks don't live close enough. You really have created a situation where you're not sustainable as a community, and so that's really where we feel like public policy has not quite tracked down to ensuring that we make sure that we have the right instruments in place. It used to be that redevelopment was one of the tools cities had to be able to bring in more affordable units where they had the capacity to. That tool was taken away.
Right.
And one of the advocacy tenets that we've had over the last 3 or 4 years is some way of restoring to cities and counties the ability to use tax increment financing to bring back some of that subsidy to bring housing costs down, to make it affordable to the working class,
Right.
and be able to build the missing middle
Yep.
or the workforce housing that's missing.
And I would suggest part of that, and I would love to solicit you into the advocacy of, there are so many state rules, regulations, new mandates, building code changes. The last building code change that included a requirement for EV charging stations
Yeah.
at a quarter of all parking structure, parking spaces, extra battery storage. All of that impact all came from a state rule.
Yeah.
A state law that basically gives construction defect lawsuits such a powerful voice in what type of housing stock is built. I mean, I would love to advocate more for sale housing.
Yes.
And the best place for new buyers to get into an ownership marketplace is through condos. But all of these 4 or 5 story apartment buildings we see are being built because you can't build condos because of construction defect lawsuits that really harm a developer's ability to build and make money on development projects, all imposed by state law. So it is such an interesting battle to see how you have the local focus and local concerns take into effect, state priorities that sometimes squash that, state priorities that give more motivation for certain things. So those are all challenging aspects. But let's end on a positive note. I don't want to be a complainer about this. But, at this point in time, probably one of the biggest regional points of interest by a lot of people is the 2028 Olympics.
Yes.
As LA, it's its home, and some of us wish LA would share more with neighboring counties. But whatever it is, and we have 2 events, major event venues down in Orange County. But moving people who stay in San Bernardino because there's not many places to stay when they come for the Olympics in LA, but a lot of events are in LA. How is SCAG playing a part in this whole, probably the single most important immediate regional transportation challenge that we have?
Yeah, no, I really want to talk about the Olympics, but I just want to close. I want to close out on the housing conversation because I think it's.
I thought I transitioned.
No, I think it's a great transition. Honestly, it's a great transition. But I think just to end on a good note on that is to suggest that we're not closing shop on working on the advocacy, because you did say that.
Yeah.
Recent state law that came with the budget process, AB 130, froze building codes for the next, I don't know, 9-10 years.
Exactly.
So this is part of advocacy. It didn't come about just out of the goodness of everybody's hearts. It was something that folks felt like was a problem. So I just want to note that there is shift that's happening because there's a very clear
Yes.
recognition
Oh,
that
thank you for pointing that out.
that
That was
we're
a
not
very
doing,
positive
yeah, that
aspect.
we're not doing all the right things, and I think we're beginning to understand that we need to start doing some things
And also
that's housing
within
positive.
that same legislation, if there was a pre-existing development use on a piece of land and it's
Yes,
transitioning to from retail to residential, in many cases, there's a lesser requirement for the environmental review
review
process because
process.
it's already been
That's
used
right.
for, so
Yeah.
yes, there were, I believe from my pro-housing perspective, there were a couple really significant things that took
Yeah,
place in
so
that.
there
So,
is progress in
yes,
that end.
good. Shoot.
Now,
All right, the Olympics.
shifting to
Tell
the
me how this
Olympics,
is going to work.
I think it's the Olympics are usually the largest gathering of humanity in any one place every 4 years, and I think this 28 games will be the largest ever, is what we estimate.
So
Um,
we are excited but terrified of that,
Well,
right?
and we should be partly terrified, but it's it's no greater terror than when you know you're going to host, and you want to make sure that you put out your best foot and
Right.
you receive the world in a on a grand scale. I think we'll be up to it. I always start with the fact that the Olympics are going to be great because the athletes are going to be great. They never disappoint. They're going to come and perform. And for us at SCAG, the big deal is how people move. That's going to be the big issue. And with the current Olympic planning process, we're part of the Games Mobility Executive Team, and we're thinking through all of the aspects of mobility. There will be special mobility opportunities for the athletes and the officials and the games family. But there will also still be visitors, which we expect about 15 million spectators. We have more events than any Olympics coming to the 28 games. We will have more events. The locations are beginning to be identified. I'm not sure we have all of them fully identified, but they're in LA. A chunk of them are actually not in the city of LA, they're in Long Beach. And you said you mentioned that there are two here. And it's compact enough that, and I think part of what went into that, again, not being privy to all of it, is there's this need to secure the games, and security is a big issue. So you don't want the games to spread out. But what we're looking at in terms of mobility, we have two assignments at SCAG right now to look at what we call travel demand management on the people side and also on the goods side, goods movement side. People always refer to, we did this in 84 and everybody stayed home. Well, 84 and 28 are going to be two very different time scales,
Right.
and
Exactly.
and things that exist totally different. In that time, we have fewer sporting events in 84, fewer athletes in 84, and that's just to note
And
that.
fewer people living
And
here.
fewer people living here.
Right.
Five more million people
Right.
now live here than lived here in 84. And so one of our assignments is to understand where the venues are, where people need to be, but also make sure that we can handle folks getting by and doing their natural, normal, everyday activities
Right.
within the region and sustaining the economy of the region, but also having goods and services delivered as well. And so working through those strategies is one of the assignments we have at SCAG.
Right.
We're gonna come up with strategies that are going to be vetted across the region. Might be testing some of them as part of the World Cup next year, and so that is a focus.
Right.
Now,
So it started out the discussion of transportation.
yeah,
It started out as being a car-free Olympics, and I think stepped a little bit away from there being a transit-first
first,
Olympics. And I think everybody could understand if you're moving a lot of people from one spot to a single pointed destination, how do you get them there safely and also with all the challenges of
yeah,
security? So that means there's a greater reliance on the Metrolink train system, a greater reliance on
on the bus
bus
system.
system. But I understand the bus desire just to move people would be greater than all the buses that are presently operating within transit systems in Southern
That's
California.
right.
So you need to double that
That's right.
in some way.
Yeah.
How are you looking at all of those things?
So,
And I know it's not just on your plate, but it's certainly
oh,
you are such an important player
yeah,
in
and we're
those.
part of that conversation. But the the supplemental bus system, which is a big element of this, given that it's transit first. And why is it transit first? Most of our venues will not afford us parking. So there's no way to drive in and out like you would drive to a stadium and drive out. Given that the games are going to be going on for, between the Summer Olympics and the Paralympics, we have about 40 or so days of activities that'll be going on. And so having vehicles parked at venues like we're used to will not work. And so being able to bus people to a certain point and have access by foot, by micromobility or shuttle, I think seem to be the better way of doing this. We're going to need more buses. LA Metro is charged with that. They've taken that very seriously. They're working on, and they've modeled and created the opportunities to better understand what that scenario is going to look like. And so co-opting the transit agencies within the region into a partnership with them also requires that we bring additional buses, almost 3,000 additional buses coming into the region. And that's in of itself, it's a feat,
right.
Because it's not just buses showing up, it's bus drivers and mechanics and where they live and where the buses are parked, where they're serviced and things like that. So it's a very complex need that needs to be put in place.
Is that same thing as it applies to trains?
Well, there'll be Metrolink is also looking to expand their fleet, and I think there will be a need to bring additional fleet in that they don't have right now. That might be, loaned or borrowed from other properties across the region, and they're working with counterparts across the region to work to
and
get
who
that
pays
done.
for all of that?
That's part of the funding that we're seeking from both federal and state, because none of us in the region have the capacity within our current funding to fund that additional level of service and service provision. So we're looking for federal and state monies, mostly federal money, to do that. I think there is a budget that's before the federal government that we're advocating for, and we're expecting that they will come to play. In the last reconciliation bill, there was $1 billion that the federal government put in place already for Olympic security, and so that gives us a sense of a down payment and the recognition at the federal level that the Olympics are going to be here.
Right.
And there's a need to start thinking about, because it's a national security event, as it's been deemed. So there will be very high focus on it. So we expect, and you just saw, I don't know if you saw the news last week, that the president has set up a task force that he chairs on the Olympics. And so we know there is a federal focus on it. Obviously, there's a concerted local focus on it, and we expect that the games will be a regional effect. While the venues might be in certain locations, folks are going to be all over our region.
Right.
You have destinations in Orange County that I'm sure many people will come to.
It'll all be filled, I'm sure. And all we
need to be able to get them in and out of those places.
And that we hope all the leaders
seamlessly.
on all levels play nice with each other and know that this is not just a LA event or a regional event, but a national event.
It's a national event.
Great opportunity.
And I feel like I'm optimistic that we will all play nice on
Well,
this
that's the one thing about you. Out of all the burdens that you focus on through your job and the focus of a regional government, you are always seen as that optimistic voice and someone who looked for that positive future. So I want to thank you very much for coming and chatting with me today and sharing with everybody, how significant and important your role is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For the time.
Thanks for being here.
Appreciate it.